The sound of IBM tabulating machines filled the basement, a relentless metallic clatter that never stopped day or night. In the cramped underground chamber beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a man in a red velvet smoking jacket stood hunched over stacks of printouts, his eyes bloodshot from 48 hours without sleep. Commander Joseph Rochefort held a fragment of decrypted Japanese text in his trembling hands. The message mentioned a target codenamed AF, and Rochefort was certain he knew exactly where AF was. The problem was convincing Washington. What followed would become one of the most consequential intelligence victories in military history, a triumph built not on superior firepower or numerical advantage, but on one man's nearly forgotten skill, the ability to think in Japanese. 6 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, Rochefort had stood in that same basement as explosions echoed across Pearl Harbor. The attack had caught America completely by surprise, a catastrophic intelligence failure that cost thousands of lives and nearly crippled the Pacific Fleet. Rochefort's unit, officially known as the Combat Intelligence Unit but referred to by its radio call sign station, Shaipo, had been unable to provide warning. They had been assigned to crack the Japanese flag officer's code, a cipher that would never be broken during the entire war. Meanwhile, the crucial Japanese Naval Operational Code, designated JN-25, was being worked by other stations. Pearl Harbor burned, and Rochefort felt the weight of that failure in his bones. If you find this story gripping, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these deep historical investigations. After the smoke cleared and the dead were counted, everything changed. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day 1941 to take command of the Pacific Fleet. What he found was a shattered force and a demoralized command structure. But Nimitz also found something else. 2 officers with an unusual skill set. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton served as the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer. Commander Joseph Rochefort ran Station Haibo. Both men shared something rare in the pre-war Navy. They spoke fluent Japanese. Not textbook Japanese, not tourist phrasebook Japanese, but the complex, nuanced language of Imperial Japan's military and diplomatic establishment. They had acquired this skill through a Navy program that sent promising officers to Tokyo for 3 years of intensive language immersion. Rochefort had arrived in Tokyo in 1929 and stayed until 1932. The naval attaché at the American Embassy had given him exactly 2 orders: master the Japanese language and stay out of trouble. Beyond that, he was essentially on his own. Rochefort immersed himself completely. He lived in Japanese neighborhoods, frequented Japanese establishments, and spent countless hours studying not just vocabulary and grammar, but the cultural context that shaped how Japanese military officers thought and communicated. What most Americans never understood was that Japanese wasn't just a different language, it was a different way of organizing reality. Word order mirrored Latin rather than English, with verbs placed at sentence endings. Multiple levels of politeness existed, each carrying subtle social signals. 3 different writing systems intertwined. Chinese characters called kanji, and 2 indigenous syllabic systems, hiragana and katakana. During those 3 years in Tokyo, Rochefort met another language officer named Edwin Layton. The 2 men formed a friendship based on shared intellectual curiosity and a growing understanding of Japan's military ambitions. What Layton didn't know at the time was that Rochefort had already spent 2 years in cryptology in Washington before coming to Tokyo. This combination of language expertise and code-breaking experience would prove decisive a decade later. The challenge facing Rochefort's team in early 1942 was immense. JN-25 was not a simple substitution cipher. It was a super-enciphered code meaning the Japanese first converted their messages into 5-digit code groups using a codebook containing approximately 33,000 entries, then added another layer of encryption by adding random 5-digit numbers from a second book called an additive table. To read a single message, American cryptanalysts first had to strip away the additive layer, then decode the underlying code groups, then translate the highly technical Japanese naval terminology into intelligible English. And even when they succeeded, they were often left with fragments like trying to understand a novel with most of the pages missing. Station Hypo occupied a windowless basement that measured roughly 30 by 40 feet. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of electronics. Rows of desks held piles of intercepts, IBM punch cards, and handwritten worksheets. The team worked in rotating shifts, but the key personnel often remained for days at a stretch, sleeping on cots when exhaustion overwhelmed them. Rochefort himself rarely left the basement, and when he did, he often forgot what time of day it was. He developed the habit of wearing a red velvet smoking jacket and carpet slippers, partly for comfort and partly because he had stopped caring about appearances. The senior code breakers under Rochefort included Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, who specialized in the mathematical aspects of cryptanalysis, and Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright, another gifted analyst. But the key to translating the fragments they recovered was linguistic expertise. Marine Captain Alva Laswell had spent 3 years studying Japanese in Tokyo and had worked at the Navy's Shanghai Intercept Station. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan possessed an almost intuitive grasp of Japanese syntax that allowed him to make sense of fragmentary decrypts that baffled others. These men didn't just translate words. They reconstructed meaning from contextual clues, military convention, and their deep understanding of how Japanese naval officers expressed themselves. Each successful carrier raid by American forces in early 1942 provided a windfall of intelligence. When American carriers struck Japanese garrison islands at Kwajalein, Wake, and Marcus, the Japanese responded with flurries of radio traffic tied to known events. These messages allowed the Hypo team to correlate code groups with specific places, ships, and dates. Gradually, the fog began to lift. By April 1942, Rochefort's team was intercepting approximately 60% of Japanese naval communications, analyzing about 40%, and actually reading fragments of roughly 10 to 15%. It doesn't sound like much, but combined with traffic analysis, the study of message externals like addresses, precedence, and length, it was enough to begin seeing patterns. In late April, the patterns pointed toward something big. Intercepts began mentioning a major operation being planned for a location designated AF. Other intercepts referenced the Aleutians. The pieces suggested a two-pronged offensive, but the target remained unclear. Rochefort became convinced that AF meant Midway Island, a tiny atoll roughly 300 miles northwest of Honolulu. The strategic logic made sense. Midway was close enough to Hawaii to threaten Pearl Harbor, and capturing it would extend Japan's defensive perimeter while potentially luring the weakened American carrier force into a decisive battle. But Washington disagreed. Station Negat, the code-breaking unit at Navy headquarters, analyzed the same intercepts and reached different conclusions. Some analysts believed AF referred to Johnston Island. Others thought it might be the west coast of the United States, or even Hawaii itself. The recently appointed commander of OP-20G, the Navy's Signals Intelligence Organization, was a communications officer with no cryptanalytic background. He clashed repeatedly with Rochefort, whom he considered uncooperative and territorial. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations and Nimitz's superior in Washington, was inclined to trust his own analysts over an eccentric commander in a basement thousands of miles away. The tension between Pearl Harbor and Washington had deep roots. Before Pearl Harbor, the intelligence situation in Washington had been dysfunctional, with 4 different directors of naval intelligence cycling through in little more than a year. Bureaucratic battles raged over who controlled signals intelligence. The Office of Naval Intelligence was forbidden from providing assessments of intelligence, since the War Plans Division had claimed that function as its own. Just before the December 7th attack, War Plans had officially assessed that Japan would not attack the United States, but would strike Russia instead. Oni disagreed but had no authority to say so. The disaster at Pearl Harbor had done nothing to resolve these institutional conflicts. Rochefort needed proof that would convince even the skeptics. One of his staff officers, Jasper Holmes, suggested a deceptively simple plan. What if they tricked the Japanese into revealing what AF meant? The idea was elegant. Have the Midway garrison send an uncoded radio message reporting a breakdown in their water purification system. If the Japanese intercepted this message and retransmitted it, mentioning that AF was experiencing water problems, that would confirm the target. Rochefort took the idea to Layton, who brought it to Nimitz. The admiral approved immediately. On May 19, 1942, a message was sent to Midway via the secure undersea communications cable that connected the island to Oahu. The base commander was instructed to broadcast an open radio message claiming the water evaporators had broken down. The message went out in the clear, easily intercepted by Japanese listening stations across the Pacific. The response came faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours, American intercept stations picked up a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of water. The transmission was addressed to the radio designation for Japanese Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Tokyo. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, the Navy's Signals Intelligence Station in Australia, published the translation on May 22nd. The identity of the target was confirmed. AF was Midway. Even with this confirmation, Washington remained skeptical. The principle of too good to be true haunted the analysts. Could this be Japanese deception? Was Rochefort being played? Admiral King remained unconvinced about the timing of the attack, believing it would come in mid-June rather than the early June date Rochefort predicted. Eventually, King ordered an assessment sent directly from Rochefort, bypassing the usual chain of command. When Rochefort delivered his analysis, laying out the evidence with precision, King finally relented. But cracking AF was only part of the puzzle. The Japanese encrypted their date-time groups separately, using an additional layer of super-encipherment. Without breaking this system, American forces would know where the attack was coming, but not exactly when. The team at Hypo went into what they called an all-out effort, searching through stacks of printouts and punch cards for patterns in 5-digit number sequences. Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan made the breakthrough. Working through exhaustion, he identified the method the Japanese had used to conceal their date-time groups. An intercept from May 26 contained orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports. When Finnegan applied his newly discovered table to the message, the date snapped into focus. The operation would commence on June 4th or 5. Combined with other intelligence indicating the attack would come from the northwest, Hypo had provided Nimitz with something unprecedented, a detailed forecast of enemy intentions. On May 27th, Nimitz called Layton into his office and asked a simple question: where and when would the Japanese attack? Layton, drawing on everything Hypo had provided and his own years studying Japanese military thinking, gave an answer that would echo through the annals of intelligence history. The Japanese carriers would approach from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees. They would be detected approximately 175 nautical miles from Midway. The attack would begin on the morning of June 4th at approximately 0600. Nimitz nodded. He had made his decision. That same day, Nimitz issued Oplan 2942, ordering Enterprise and Hornet to proceed to the vicinity of Midway. Yorktown, still under repair from damage sustained at the Battle of the Coral Sea, would follow as soon as emergency repairs were complete. The work crews at Pearl Harbor performed miracles, returning Yorktown to sea in just 3 days, when the estimate had been 3 months. Nimitz also made another critical decision. The battleships of Task Force 1 would remain on the West Coast. They were too slow, too vulnerable to air attack, and consumed too much fuel. This was to be a carrier battle. What Nimitz understood, perhaps better than anyone else in American command, was that intelligence was worthless if commanders didn't act on it. His predecessor had received warning of suspicious Japanese activity before December 7th, but had failed to respond adequately. Nimitz would not repeat that mistake. He trusted Leighton, Leighton trusted Rochefort, and both men trusted the painstaking work of the cryptanalysts who had spent months in that windowless basement, turning fragments into forecasts. The Japanese, meanwhile, sailed with supreme confidence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had designed an elaborate plan to draw out and destroy the American carrier force. The capture of Midway was almost secondary. The real objective was a decisive naval battle that would eliminate American power in the Pacific for at least a year, giving Japan time to consolidate its conquests and build an impenetrable defensive perimeter. Yamamoto believed he held every advantage. The Americans had only 2 or perhaps 3 carriers operational. The Japanese had 4 fleet carriers in the striking force, with 2 light carriers supporting the Aleutians operation, plus a massive invasion fleet. What Yamamoto did not know was that his entire operational plan had been compromised from the beginning. Japanese naval intelligence had detected increased high-priority American message traffic in the days before the operation, but senior commanders dismissed the significance. They remained fixated on the plan and convinced it could not have been compromised. This was what later analysts would call victory disease, the sense of invincibility that followed 6 months of unbroken success, combined with fatigue from non-stop operations. The Japanese had planned a reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor using long-range flying boats that would refuel from submarines at French frigate shoals, a tiny atoll midway between Oahu and Midway Island. This Operation K would determine whether American carriers were in port. But when the Japanese submarine arrived at French frigate shoals, it discovered an American seaplane tender and destroyer anchored there. Nimitz had sent them specifically to prevent exactly this reconnaissance. The refueling submarines lingered for days, hoping the Americans would leave. They didn't. On May 31st, Operation K was canceled. The Japanese striking force would sail blind. A submarine reconnaissance line was supposed to detect any American carriers transiting from Pearl Harbor to Midway. 7 submarines would form a picket line between the 2 locations, but mechanical difficulties delayed the departure of several boats, and the politically connected rear admiral commanding the submarine force decided not to inform Yamamoto of the problem. It wouldn't have mattered anyway. By the time the submarines finally reached their stations, all 3 American carriers had already passed. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the Japanese launched their strike against Midway Island with 108 aircraft. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier striking force from his flagship Akagi, had accepted a weak reconnaissance plan that covered only about 200 degrees of ocean in a scattered pattern. He believed he still held the element of surprise. He believed, based on faulty intelligence about American carrier losses at Coral Sea, that he faced at most 1 enemy carrier. He believed that carrier was still in Pearl Harbor and would need to be drawn out. At 0534, a PBY Catalina flown by Lieutenant Howard Adie spotted Japanese ships northwest of Midway and broadcast the sighting. Minutes later, another Catalina pilot, Lieutenant William Chase, spotted the incoming Japanese airstrike and reported many aircraft heading toward Midway. Then Chase saw them, Japanese carriers. At 0552, he transmitted the contact. Midway radar detected the incoming strike at 0553. Word reached the American carriers positioned northeast of Midway at a location designated Point Luck shortly after 600. Layton's prediction had been accurate to within 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles. The battle that followed lasted 3 days and transformed the Pacific War. American torpedo bombers from all 3 carriers attacked the Japanese fleet in uncoordinated waves, suffering devastating losses. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft and all but 1 crew member. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The low-flying torpedo planes drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the higher altitudes undefended. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4th, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. In 5 minutes, they turned the course of the war. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were transformed into flaming wrecks by bomb hits that penetrated to their hangar decks where fully fueled and armed aircraft waited. Hiryu survived the initial attack and launched a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown, but by afternoon, American bombers found her too. All 4 Japanese fleet carriers sank within 24 hours, along with a heavy cruiser and over 300 aircraft. Japan lost many of its most experienced pilots and maintenance crews, losses that could never be replaced. The Japanese official analysis of the battle, written afterward, contained a revealing admission. Mobile Force Commander Nagumo's estimates assumed that the enemy was not aware of Japanese plans and that the fleet had not been discovered until the morning of June 5th at the earliest. In reality, the entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. The intelligence victory at Midway represented more than just breaking codes. It demonstrated the value of deep cultural and linguistic understanding. Rochefort didn't simply translate Japanese words into English. He understood how Japanese naval officers thought, how they expressed themselves, and what their communications patterns revealed about their intentions. His years in Tokyo had given him something that no machine could provide: the ability to think like the enemy. Layton's prediction to Nimitz reflected the same depth of understanding. When he estimated where and when the Japanese would attack, he wasn't just extrapolating from intercepted messages. He was applying everything he had learned about Japanese naval doctrine, operational preferences, and the personal tendencies of Japanese commanders he had studied for more than a decade. Nimitz had told Layton his job was to think like Admiral Yamamoto. On the morning of June 4th, that's exactly what he had done. The irony is that these language skills had been something of an afterthought in both men's careers. The Navy had established the language officer program in the 1920s, sending promising officers to Tokyo for immersion training. But intelligence work was generally considered non-career enhancing. Junior officers assigned to intelligence billets on battleships were sometimes also made the ship's laundry officers. For a non-naval academy officer like Rochefort, the assignment was acceptable. For an Annapolis graduate like Layton, it was considered a risk to his advancement. Yet these marginalized skills proved decisive when the fate of the Pacific hung in the balance. The ability to read fragmentary Japanese text, to understand cultural context, to interpret ambiguous communications with nuance and accuracy. These were not skills that appeared on promotion boards or earned medals. But without them, American carriers would have sailed blind into a Japanese ambush, and the war might have lasted years longer. The aftermath of the battle brought bitter disappointment for Rochefort. Despite his extraordinary contribution, or perhaps because of it, powerful enemies in Washington moved against him. OP-20G recalled him from Hypo on a pretext. He never returned to intelligence work. He was given command of a floating dry dock, about as far from code-breaking as the Navy could send him. Admiral Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal, but C&O King denied the recommendation on the advice of Rochefort's Washington chain of command, who then took credit for having predicted the Midway operation themselves. Rochefort never publicly complained. He finished out his career in obscurity, retiring as a captain. He passed away in 1976, still largely unknown to the public. Only in the 1970s, when intelligence records were finally declassified, did the true story begin to emerge. A former ensign from Station Hypo, who had risen to Rear Admiral, named Donald Showers, launched a years-long campaign to secure recognition for his former commander. Finally, in 1985, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded Joseph Rochefort the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. Justice came 9 years too late for Rochefort to see it. Edwin Layton fared better in some ways, eventually reaching flag rank and serving with distinction throughout the war. But he too spent decades frustrated by the inability to tell the full story of Midway. Classification restrictions prevented him from explaining how the intelligence had actually been obtained. When popular accounts credited magic or luck for the American victory, Layton could say nothing. Only late in life could he finally share the complete history. Captain Alva Laswell and Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan continued their cryptanalytic work throughout the war. Their contributions to breaking Japanese communications enabled numerous subsequent operations, including the interception that led to the elimination of Admiral Yamamoto himself in 1943. The unglamorous work of linguists and code breakers performed in windowless basements and crowded offices shaped the course of battles they would never see. The lessons of Midway extend far beyond 1942. The battle demonstrated that intelligence advantage could offset material disadvantage. The Japanese had more carriers, more aircraft, more experienced pilots, but the Americans knew what was coming. That knowledge allowed Nimitz to position his inferior force for maximum effect, achieving surprise instead of suffering it. 3 carriers against 4, with accurate intelligence, proved more than enough. The battle also revealed the importance of linguistic and cultural expertise in intelligence work. Technical code breaking, the mathematical stripping of ciphers and recovery of additives, was essential. But without linguists who understood not just the words but the context, the decrypts would have been useless fragments. John Hurt, the Army's primary Japanese linguist before the war, had never formally studied Japanese or lived in Japan. He learned the language from a college roommate, yet he amazed even officers who had spent years in Tokyo with his detailed knowledge. Such skills cannot be mass-produced. They must be cultivated over years. Today, intelligence agencies continue to struggle with the same fundamental challenge. Technical collection capabilities have advanced exponentially since 1942. Satellites, electronic intercepts, and computer analysis can gather information in quantities Rochefort never imagined. But the interpretation of that information still requires human expertise. Understanding adversary intentions still requires knowing how they think, what their cultural assumptions are, and how they communicate meaning. Machines can translate words, humans understand minds. The basement where Rochefort and his team worked their miracles is gone now, demolished in the decades since the war. The IBM tabulating machines that clattered through the night have been replaced by supercomputers billions of times more powerful. The punch cards and paper worksheets have given way to digital networks spanning the globe. But the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Intelligence is not just about collecting information. It is about understanding it, and understanding requires knowledge that cannot be automated. The kind of deep, intuitive grasp of language and culture that Rochefort acquired during 3 years walking the streets of Tokyo, learning to think in a language he had once considered impenetrably foreign. Commander Joseph Rochefort spent the final years of the war commanding a floating dry dock in San Francisco Bay. He never saw combat again. He never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. But in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, during the crucial weeks of May 1942, he performed one of the most consequential acts of analysis in military history. He looked at fragmentary evidence, applied decades of accumulated expertise, and reached a conclusion that Washington refused to accept. Then he devised a brilliant deception to prove his case. And when Admiral Nimitz asked where the Japanese would attack, Rochefort provided the answer that made victory possible. The Japanese aircraft carriers that sank at Midway represented the elite of the Imperial Navy. Their loss shattered Japan's offensive capability and forced a strategic shift to defense. The tide of the Pacific War turned not because of superior American firepower, but because one eccentric commander in a smoking jacket refused to accept the consensus view. His weapon was knowledge, his ammunition was language, and his victory changed the world. When historians analyze the Battle of Midway, they often focus on the dramatic moments, the torpedo plane attacks, the dive bomber strikes, the explosions that consumed the Japanese carriers. These images are powerful and true. But the battle was decided before the first aircraft launched. It was decided in a basement by men who had spent years preparing for a moment they never expected to see. Joseph Rochefort's forgotten language skill, acquired in Tokyo more than a decade before the war, proved more decisive than any weapon in the American arsenal. Understanding the enemy meant defeating the enemy. And that understanding began with the simple, unglamorous work of learning to speak their language.